You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy and John Walsh.
And special guest, Bruce.
Now, there's an endless amount of information on any given topic, and sometimes you just need somebody to extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting.
So, the person I want to talk about is somebody that you brought up a little bit before we started recording, Bruce, and that is Sarah Palin. And the reason why I think Sarah Palin is such a great example of this sort of divide that we've been kind of discussing is the ticket she was on was divided, right? So you had an establishment Republican who considered himself a rogue, but really kind of wasn't. You know, he was kind of bread and butter Republican with the, you know, as far as the establishment's concerned, the real rogue. You had the Sarah Palin who hit these identity politic buttons throughout the campaign. So I want to know what effect that started. Was it a chain reaction the way I see it? Do you guys see it the same way? And, you know, how is that playing out in the world of the MAGA Trump phenomenon? So, Bruce, I'll start with you.
So I tried to find it before we had this podcast, but there is a particular moment where during the McCain-Palin campaign, they go to Virginia. And Sarah Palin basically is in Southern Virginia. And she basically says, hey, this is the real America.
Yeah, I remember that.
And the other America, or the other people who I guess who apparently aren't real Americans, are the people who are, I guess, you know, in Washington. But it's very much part of what's being woven into the MAGA identity is this idea that there are people who live in cities, and then there's the real Americans who don't. You know, and if you're living in a city, you represent some sort of elite viewpoint that doesn't fit with like the real image of what America should be. And so, yeah, with the McCain-Palin candidacy, what you saw is the sort of the split identity of the Republican Party, which is cultural issues that drive voter engagement, who get voters to the polls, very much like, you know, we need to go to the polls to stop this particular cultural, you know, warfare issue that we're pushing this week, you know, whether or not it's, you know, caravans showing up at the border, et cetera, right? And then McCain was very much representative of the establishment Republican candidates that they kind of always kept bringing up. It almost became, you know, predictable that the Republican Party would have a bunch of sort of right-wingers who supported sort of Trump-like views, but then they would always eventually fall by the wayside as the Republicans used their own version of electability argument, to basically say, yeah, you guys really care about these issues, but if we want somebody who's going to be elected, we have to go with a Romney, we have to go with a Bush, or we have to go with a McCain. And McCain was very much, I think he wanted to pull in another Republican that was in that same vein, but I think the Republican Party realized that their voters would not be engaged unless they pulled somebody like a Sarah Palin into the party. And if you listen to what Sarah Palin would basically say off the cuff remarks and stuff, she was sort of a Trump precursor.
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, I heard it said a few weeks ago that the Republican Party is a three-legged stool, and that stool is made up of national security, economic interests, and cultural issues. And John McCain really kind of embodied the national security and somewhat of the economic portion of it, whereas Sarah Palin was that third leg. She was the cultural ideal.
Well, what I would argue is that the economic and national security interests are actually the same. They're not two distinct things. The economic policy and the national security policy are essentially, you know, two parts of the same.
Perhaps they meant tax policy or, you know, personal economic.
Well, what you have is you have the donor class of the Republican Party has specific interests. And their interests span, you know, tax policy, trade policy, and, you know, economic security is really an extension, in America at least, our military the national security
apparatus
is designed to serve the economic interest of people in the country. So, if you take that into consideration, why we support brutal regimes and give them military hardware here, and then turn around and say, hey, you're a brutal regime, you can't have any guns, you can't have any tanks over here. And you think, well, why does that make any sense? And the only way to make sense of it is, well, there's an economic interest involved in, making sure that the people over here who are sitting on the oil that they're willing to sell us have planes, guns, and tanks to defend their interests so that they can continue to sell us oil. Right. So the economic interest, which is we need to have access to resources, it overrides that, and I think that's all one particular view, and that's reflected in the Republican donor class.
So, Josh, did the Palin leg of the stool take over the rest of the party, or is it? I mean, is there a national security interest still within? Because if you look at Trump's foreign policy, you would think that they've abandoned national security. So is the Republican Party just the party of Palin and Trump's cultural war?
I think it in many ways is, and I'm glad you brought up national security because I personally believe it isn't. It's actually just painted as national security because that's a more appealing term. A lot of it has to do with the fact that, for a variety of reasons, I think because culturally we have totally become sucked into this like reality TV, Twitter nature. Sarah Palin, she was sensationalist. She got the most attention. She appealed to the worst part of us, and in a logical world, people would have just rolled their eyes at her and focused on John McCain. He was a maverick in the sense where he was more Republican, but he didn't vote exclusively along party lines. He would vote against Republicans if he believed against what they, just like his last vote against taking away healthcare from poor people and everything. So he, it plays to this sensationalism, but in a way where I do believe that it plays to the worst of us, because the function and the reason we need a well-functioning society is because people are not great by nature. We are selfish. We are tribalistic. And yet when we have a culture and a society and a set of rules that are structured well and fair and everything, it encourages us and promotes us to, keep to limit the worst parts of ourselves and bring out the best parts of ourselves, because then it's rewarding. You have the American dream. You work hard, you're honest, you don't break the law, you'll have a home and a family and have a life of prosperity.
I don't think we can ignore the history of sort of white supremacy in America. Right. I don't want to get into a discussion that ignores the history of essentially what is sort of a ruling class of people in America making an agreement with the sort of majority white population and saying, hey, we'll cut you in a little bit, socially, economically, politically, in exchange for you providing the bulwark against the people that we're really oppressing, right? And this, of course, goes back into the context of slavery. It's like, we'll allow you to have guns. We'll allow you to be able to vote. We'll allow you to be able to own land. We'll allow you to have these rights and privileges, but not the other guy. Right. So there is a history in America where you have a class of people who were given a slice of privilege in exchange for essentially upholding the system. And so there has always been that particular context in American politics. And I think in order to try to understand where we are right now, you have to understand that over the course of time, right, if the ruling people no longer see this majority white class of people as useful anymore, they are perfectly willing to start selling them out, right, to start eroding the privileges that they have. And if it becomes convenient, if they, after the end of slavery, if now they want to cut in more people and they don't really care about providing some sort of protection against, slave insurrections or revolts or stuff like that, then there's no real need to sort of parcel out privilege to certain groups of people anymore. So I think if you belong to a group and you have sort of a generational tradition of saying, hey, we represent the sort of privileged group, we're used to having our particular points of view reflected in the culture, and that has been ongoing. And what you've been watching for the past, couple 100 years or 50 years or whatever, you take whatever slice of time and you just constantly seeing your position of privilege being eroded, then I think that helps us understand the context in which, people can be really upset because now they find themselves essentially just another person out in the milieu,
Yeah, and I see that in today's political landscape. We've talked on this show kind of extensively of how you had a Southern culture that, wanted that privilege, and how over the course of liberalization over the past 180 years, we've seen that erode. And a lot of the things that we don't even think about as white privilege, you had brought up gun ownership as one of them.
There's a political commentator named Tom Hartman.
He's a liberal talk show host, but he said something that I still would like to dig into because it made sense, but I didn't know if there was historical context to it. He was saying that the Second Amendment was really about, I want the right to form a militia of well-armed men to go out and retrieve a runaway slave and bring them back to the plantation. And I don't want that right infringed upon. So the Second Amendment had more to do with slavery retention than it did with the actual privilege of owning a firearm or overthrowing the government, especially if you look at government in in Europe during the 1930s. You had this one rogue government that had a technology of weaponry that took the entire global system to bring them down. This idea that if well-armed Jews in Germany were allowed to carry a gun, that would have stopped Nazism. Well, it took the Soviet Union and the United States, the UK, the Canadians, the Australians, the French, all to come together to beat that one army. So this argument of, well, the right to bear arms is one that is rooted in Americanism. Well, no, I think it's rooted more in American racial inequality.
Well, I just wanted to add one small point, and I think that if you are a member of the basic sort of working class of America, regardless of whether or not you're black, white, immigrant, or whatever, I think it doesn't take too long of being in this sort of labor force to realize that it's exploitative, right? And I think one of the fears is that if you lose your privilege, you just become another exploited person in the country. You have no more protection. So sometimes I try to think of people protecting their privilege not as I want to be able to have special things, but more along the view is I don't want to lose my protection against being exploited the most. I don't want to be, and this is if you look at it in the context of policing is I think the most stark example of this, right? It's a privilege, of course, to not have to be subject to police brutality, right? But if you lose that privilege, you can either think, okay, well, nobody's going to be subject to police brutality. But if you accept that police brutality is a thing, and that if you lose your protection, then you're just going to get it, right? So it's not like you're not necessarily afraid that other people are going to be able to get away with stuff and you don't want other people to be treated with dignity and respect. You're more concerned about losing your power to be able to go about society without having to worry about being pulled over and beat up or killed.
Those who enjoy privilege see equality as persecution. So, Josh, if you could touch on this topic as well, because I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Because a lot of people who are privileged will bring up struggles they have had in life, which, as an excuse for why they aren't privileged. And my response is, okay, imagine you're playing Texas Hold'em and every single hand you are dealt, you start with a pair of aces. That doesn't guarantee you're going to win every hand. It's the first two cards. However, you have a statistical probability and advantage of getting there, of winning a hand. You're going to win more hands than anyone else at the table. What happens is, imagine if you spent your entire life getting dealt a pair of aces to you, and you don't see the cards other people are being dealt, and then all of a sudden one day you sit at the table and you're dealt like a 4 and a jack. You're gonna think, just by human nature, like, can you really blame the person for having the immediate gut instinctive reaction of, whoa, what the hell is going on here? We need to stop viewing it as a zero-sum game. I hate the term culture war, because in a war, one side wins, one side loses.
So I've started to think that this anti-establishment view within, especially the political right, I mean, we're starting to see it in the political left, but it's for different reasons. I think on the political right, it's that the culture is shifting to this more inclusive, everybody has equal rights, and that's a threat to the privilege. And so they're very down with establishment. And we talked about on a different podcast how that was the view of the political left in the 60s was, don't trust anyone over 30 and down with the establishment and so on. And now it's swung to the political right, where they're just like, don't trust anyone who's not a Republican, or a conservative or a true conservative. And I look at this and think that, again, this is not a good long-term strategy for a political organization, because, this anti-establishment, inclusive culture is just narrowing your odds. And, there's a lot of talk that Trump is anti-establishment, and I haven't really seen him be anti-establishment. This idea that he's draining the swamp seems hypocritical, given, all of the scandal that he's been involved in. And then on top of that, just winning on the cultural thing, you can't really, show that. I mean, it feels like that the narrative is, with Trump, we'll win on the cultural thing, which will lead to the economic success, which will lead to national security. And I think there's a disconnect that we're not talking about in this country within that narrative, that those things do not plug in together. That if the culture they're trying to achieve somehow brings about economic prosperity, to me that is a religious belief and not necessarily a political or
rational
or
logical belief.
Yeah, it seems more superstitious in nature. And maybe I'm off topic or off my rocker on that one, but maybe Bruce, you can address that, because I know we've had similar conversations in the past.
Well, it's an argument that I find really persuasive, and it's that the culture war battles are primarily driven by a need to continuously divide the working class. That what the real conflict is in American society is class conflict, and anti-establishment politics is, in my view, an extension of this class conflict. It's since the 80s or whatever, it sort of feels like the major power shift has been towards the investor class and the donor class having most of the say in policies, and all the culture war stuff, for them at least, because they seem to be able to sort of like move around between parties. It doesn't really matter. It's like Trump said, he said it himself. He comes out and says, look, when I was a businessman, I gave to the Democrats, I gave to the Republicans. You work with both sides because, you just see the two parties as being, two groups of people who wield power, and if you need a favor, you go to whoever has power and work with them. It was a very pragmatic view, right? But it represents, I think, a view from the sort of investor donor class, which is they don't really care about the culture world issues, unless they sort of boil over and threaten to take control, which is sort of the panic that set in after Trump, right? It's like, oh my gosh, the culture world issues are taking over. We don't want that to happen. We want them to just basically divide people. Because, the worst thing that they fear is that a bunch of people will be like, hey, look, you, me, the people who are fighting against each other, Republican Democrats, fighting this culture war battle, we actually have all the same problems. And it's not, me over here, trying to protect my job against you over there trying to protect your job, and me over here trying to pay rent versus you over there trying to pay rent, or me over here, figuring out how I'm going to get health care versus you over there trying to get health care. We actually all have the same problems. But what the especially the right-wing media do is they don't want you to focus on the up and down. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had this great speech that she did where she basically said the same thing. We're forced into seeing things in a left-right spectrum. We should start looking at things in an up and down spectrum. It's not, guy who can't pay his bills versus guy who can't pay his bills, or, that way. It's the guys who can't pay their bills looking at the guys who are making it hard to do so and saying, hey, that's where the root of the problem lies. So what you find is that when we talk about identity politics, that's, culture war politics, and that is trying to drive people into separate camps. And the usefulness is to get people to not, express any kind of solidarity.
So, Josh, we see a lot of that on right-wing radio and television, that there's a creator class and a working class, or rather a taker class. There's the job creators and the takers. So how do we pull people back to just the more pragmatic view that even Donald Trump had prior to the election of, hey, it doesn't matter, whoever's in power is who you got to grease the wheels with? Is this cultural thing just pulling us away from just productivity within government?
It's hard to say what will help bring it back to a sense of like normalcy, because it's like I agree in the sense of the dividing up the working class and getting them to fight amongst each other. I think the greatest con ever pulled on the American people was convincing someone making $10 an hour that they've got it made. Because they know, shoot, if we call this person poor, let's call them working class, because if we call them poor, like we have a poor, middle, and wealthy, like upper class, like that's upper, middle, lower. But if we call them lower class, they're more likely to ask for things like benefits and a raise.
So, Bruce, doesn't having the creator class or the job creator class versus the working class or the takers, doesn't that play into more of a hierarchical structure that is kind of common within the MAGA crowd and the Trump supporters? Don't you find that that hierarchy is embraced on the political right more than the left, or is that kind of a misnomer?
No, it's embraced on the political right. There's this view that capitalism sorts people in a just way. That people who have lots of money are people who have provided the most benefit to society, right? And so, if somebody becomes a millionaire or a billionaire, it's all justified. There's no exploitation involved. But inherent in the structure of how capitalistic systems work is that you have investors, which is, I think, traditionally what people referred to as capitalists, people who owned capital and then looked for ways to use that capital in a way that would, make them wealthier, with the sort of beneficial byproduct being that they would hire people and they would create products and they would sell things. And so, the idea was that by capitalist investors using their money to create more money, then the byproduct was wealth. So built into that, though, is there's the hierarchy, because only a certain number of people are going to have, money to invest and the capital to invest. So you automatically divide, the society economically into two groups: people who have money and investors, people who have money, who are investors, who can then decide how to deploy their money in a way that they see as efficient to make them more money, and people who have to basically go and find jobs and earn wages in order to provide enough money for themselves to go and buy the products that they need. So you automatically split things into two interest groups, because the interest of people who own capital and want to invest do not align with the people who work for a living, because those two interests are running counter to each other. Capitalists want to be able to maximize profit, and employment labor costs are always considered to be too much, right? The ideal system obviously was, you bring a bunch of people over for free and you make them work for free, and that's the best arrangement according to somebody who wants to maximize profit. But next best to that is to always pit your workers against each other, battling for jobs, so that none of them have any leverage in order to be able to demand more from you than what they can take. And so that's why we have this, that's why among the left, people are like, well, we need to go back to labor organizing. And, that's what made America great, is when there were labor unions and solidarity amongst, working people, and saying, hey, look, we're not going to take crumbs. We want a slice of this. And the neoliberal revolution, the sort of Reagan-Thatcher revolution, was directly aimed at that power. How do we destroy the power of collective bargaining, organizing, and the solidarity of the working class in a way that allows us to continue to increase productivity, increase profitability, while at the same time not having to pay more?
Right.
Yeah, and I'm glad you actually brought that up. Like, I think another thing that has been misused and or weaponized against the American people is something that is so at the heart of American culture more than anywhere else, is the meritocracy argument. What they pitch is that in order to have a society that is a meritocracy, you need to have an open market, a more open market, fewer regulations and everything, whereas if you look at it, it's kind of the opposite, in the sense where, okay, well, if first look at other nations like Sweden, France, United Kingdom, you still have the right to start a business and become successful there, sure. And there, yeah, if you work harder than people who don't work hard, your business will typically be more successful. Like it isn't not a meritocracy. And suddenly you have a generation, my age, that looks at it and goes, is this the case? Like, I don't know if I quite buy into this meritocracy, because things went south for people who have followed the American dream. And yet there seems to be a few people at the top who actually, when things went south for my family, they actually made money. They got better, so people are starting to doubt it. They were starting to doubt the economic principles and party, policies that the Republicans were pitching. And one of the reasons I think Trump has been so successful, if Trump came along in 2007, everyone would have rolled their eyes and laughed at him. But the fact that he came along at the worst possible time, when the Republicans, you had plenty of establishment Republicans, they were pitching policies that people were starting to wise up to. And as a result, the third leg on the stool,
right, yeah,
was literally the only one that wasn't completely eroding.
But it is.
It is.
That's what's so perplexing to me. Is that's the basket they put all the eggs in.
Right.
Was this cultural one, which is a narrowing window. If a lot of it is religiously based in a country that's becoming less and less religious, and a lot of it is based on, racial identity or identity politics in a place that's becoming more and more liberal on those issues, it's just such a self-defeating policy or position.
It's the sunk cost theory.
Yeah, I always think of the line by Danny DeVito in Other People's Money. He says, how do you go out of business? You grab an increasing share of a decreasing market and down the drain you go. So, Bruce, I'm going to leave it to you for our final thought on this.
So I was going to say that there's a prophetic quote from Lindsey Graham. He basically said that if we elect Donald Trump, the Republican Party is doomed. And to your point about don't go chasing after a smaller group of people, like the Danny DeVito quote. What I wanted to say to that is Trump is not a long-term strategic thinker. And I don't think he understood that. And I think the Republican establishment fought that tendency. And Trump came in and said, hey, why aren't you guys, fishing where the ducks are? And they're like, because there's less and less ducks every year.
Yeah.
We need to be able to keep a bigger coalition of people. And one of the things the Tesler slide presentation basically said is, both the Democrats and Republican have struggled in many years to try to keep their coalitions as big as possible. And, Lindsey Graham was right in the sense that Trump came in and said, hey, I'm just going to stir up this small group of people who are really vocal and adamant and, get us elected. And I think he looked at that and said, yeah, but we're going to shed, moderates like you wouldn't believe. Yeah. Once the moderate people who thought we were the party of fiscal conservatism, strong national defense, and the sort of adults in the room who are trying to make everything work right. Once those Republicans see what the Republican Party has become under Trump, they're just going to leave, right? So if I were to provide a summary, what we're seeing is Trump came along and he basically saw an opportunity. He saw that there was a group of people who were consolidating around a narrative about this culture war issues, and he was able to sort of harness that energy and get elected. And that has, the election of Obama and the election of Trump has really pushed American politics deeper into sort of the playground of identity. And I think, if there's some sort of agreement between the three of us, I think it's that going in this direction is probably not going to be a good solution for the country long term. So, how did we get here, and what does it look like, and where are we going to go from here are probably the next best questions.
Awesome. Well, Bruce, from both Josh and myself, thanks for swinging by and participating in the podcast. Listeners, we appreciate you tuning in every week, and want to wish you a good week. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you might have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com. And you can also check out our other episodes at itmightbeinteresting.com. And Bruce has committed to fly out every other week to join us again. So now you're on the record. You gotta.
Screwed now, Bruce.
Okay, and remember, vote Gabbard Stein 2020.
Gabbard's Marianne Williamson, a write-in vote. There you go.
You know what? Mock her as much as you want. That's it. Just mock her.